Hello, CRA. All right, we're going to get our programming started. So this morning at the sessions, I noticed there was a lot of sunglasses on, right? We all had a great time last night. Fantastic. So, woohoo! CRA is not just about the great program content. Come on, it's really about the great people and parties, right? Exactly. So, anyways, thank you for an amazing week. It's been phenomenal. I'm a little sad to wrap it up, but ready to go home and tackle all the amazing things that I've learned over the week. So, we're going to have a few speakers come up today, but I'm looking at my notes right now. Sorry, I'm a little tired, just a tad. I think we probably hit about 100 people in our room last night. So before we get started with our keynote, we had a really exciting program that we started this year. And we wanted to talk about this program, and we want to feature the winner of the program. So this year, CRRA hosted its first 48-hour film contest. And thank you to all of those that participated. It was a really fun thing to get to watch, some really fun videos. Contestants wrote, produced, and submitted an entire 2-minute film in only 48 hours. Our 3 finalists are online, and you can visit the CRRA website to see them. The jury awards selected the film made by Team Go Bananas for Zero Waste. And we are so excited that Skyden Canfield, the team leader, is here to be recognized. So let's play that film. And Skyden, will you please join me on stage? I got a couple gifts and prizes for you. So check out Gone Bananas.
Banana growing up organic, and now I'm stuck in this disgusting plastic bag.
A jellyfish. It looks so delicious.
Don't eat that! Didn't you read that warning? What? You can't read and neither can babies? What's wrong? I was kidnapped in a terrible plastic bag, and then a turtle who couldn't read rescued me.
Where do you want to go after that tragic experience?
I want to go to Palo Alto, where I can be eaten by a zero-waste hero. That's where zero-waste heroes are everywhere. They ban evil, suffocating, single-use plastics. They are going to make people deconstruct buildings instead of throwing them away, and they compost real food wrappers like my peel, and go zero waste all the way!
All the way! Let's go!
I'm so happy! I made it to Palo Alto! A hungry person ate me, and now I'm turning into compost, nature's miracle! Zero waste all the way! Zero waste all the way!
Zero waste. Let's begin.
Excellent job. We have a CRRA t-shirt and a CRRA vest for you. Thank you so much. We love the video. And you brought one of the stars.
Yeah, here's my hippo. He was the director. He wasn't actually in the film. This is a lot dirtier of a hippo, but we couldn't let the dirty one go in. But hey, he did the action and stuff. Yeah, that was cool.
So he's the zero waste superhero. So thank you so much, Skyden. We
Yeah.
really appreciate it. A round of applause. Thank you. So again, to learn more and see the other films, please visit CRRA.com. Thank you so much. Woo! That was really exciting. Despina and the staff team came up with that contest. So hopefully we'll get a lot more entries next year. So again, thank you for everyone that participated. So it's been a great conference. And we have another great conference next year. And so with that, I'd like to invite up to the stage one of our conference co-chairs, Monica. And also our newest board member, Kobe, is going to be a conference co-chair but he had to go actually do some work today. So Monica is going to tee it off for next year.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed being in the desert. Next year, we're excited to announce that we're going to go to the other side of the state. We're going to Burlingame. The conference is going to be August 15th through the 19th, so mark your calendars. Bring your jackets, because it'll be a little cooler. But we're excited to be back there since we haven't been there since 2008.
Thank you. And I'll see everyone at that conference. So I'm going to ask Nick to come to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker. Have a great lunch. Thank you.
Good morning. So I have the pleasure of introducing a good friend of mine and my zero waste hero, Calla Rose Ostrander. Calla Rose works to expand awareness, adoption, and advanced policy surrounding compost and carbon farming in California and the Western United States. She's a climate change innovations advisor to individuals and organizations dedicated to stabilizing the Earth's climate. She's currently working with the People, Food, and Land Foundation, expanding composting and healthy soils adoption in California and the Western United States. Before moving to California, she co-authored the City of Aspen's first climate action adaptation plan and was a communications fellow for the Rocky Mountain Institute. She's also my partner in crime in advancing composting statewide, and probably the one person who pushes me the most to think beyond what I think is possible. Calla Rose.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you still see my face if I tip my hat? I can see you better. All right. Well, it's been a wonderful week, and I think we're all kind of tired. We all sat like this at our last panel, even though we were on the panel. So I fully understand if you just need to space out for a little bit. I'm going to tell you a story, a little bit about how the planet works, and I hope that by the end of it, you will see very clearly where you and we all fit into that story. In asking folks today what I should talk about, I heard two things very clearly. One, they want an update on the Marin Carbon Project and what's happened with that work. And two, to really explain this cycle that we're all in, this really big life cycle, so to speak. I wish I could have gotten Beyonce here to sing for us, or Elton John, but short of that, I'll just go through this with what we have. So, we are a solar system. We are a solar-powered planet. All of the energy on our planet comes from this sun or this star. Even when we look at nuclear energy, or we'd say, fission, that's the same energy that's happening within a star, right? So all of our energy is fundamentally coming from the sun. And it's important to remember that what we're eating, what we're wearing, the electricity we're burning, the fuels we're driving in, are all ultimately at some point derived from our solar system. That sunlight comes to Earth, to our beautiful planet that has this miraculous thing called water. And water gives us life. And it gives rise to plants. We're not quite sure how they got here. Some people think they came on an asteroid in the form of mushrooms. We're not totally sure how they got here, but we have this beautiful miracle where plants essentially eat the sunlight, right? Autotrophs. They're eating the sunlight and turning it into something that we can eat. So animals eat the plants, and we in turn eat plants and animals. This is a really big cycle that we're all involved with on a daily basis, and that creates life as we know it. Creates the oxygen that we breathe, creates the food that we eat, creates the shelter that we have today, and that movement of energy from the sun to the earth, to life that water gives us, to plants, to animals, puts us in a very special position. Actually, the Navajo put humans in the center of the medicine wheel. They are the fifth direction. So that's the carbon cycle, right, from maybe more a holistic perspective. Now, humans have done something in the last couple of centuries where we've really started to break that carbon cycle. We burn a tremendous amount of fossil fuels, as you all know. We plow the land, we burn forests, we move that carbon that's slowly circulating through our system out back into the atmosphere, and it's caused this imbalance. Sometimes we think about carbon as pollution, but what I want you all to indulge me with is thinking about it as a fundamental element that's really out of place. We've moved a lot more of it from where it was underground and in our terrestrial ecosystems like forests into the atmosphere, and that's causing an imbalance in our life cycle. Now, luckily, plants both in the ocean and in trees and on land, they inhale every year, right? We sequester those emissions back into the earth. Because we're in the desert, I wanted to point out that actually desert ecosystems, even though we don't think about them, are huge sequesters of carbon, and desert soils store vast amounts of carbon at depth for a long period of time. So even though we commonly think about forests or oceans as sequestering carbon, deserts are actually a really key part of this process. In fact, anywhere there's a photosynthetic process happening, we are synthesizing that carbon with the power of the sunlight and turning it into carbohydrates, things that we all can live off of, all life can live off of. So at the end of the day, when the earth is done breathing all of that carbon in and all the plants are done breathing it in, about 44% of what we put into the atmosphere, in excess of what would normally be there, is left over. That's why we have this classic curve. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar with this? This is the Keeling Curve. So for those of us who have been in climate policy for a long time, this was sort of like a transformational graphic. It's the observation of the carbon parts per million that's pulled off of the top of a sacred mountain in Hawaii every year. And that rise is that 44%, it dips down. And what we want to do is bring the curve back down. So right now, every year, we burn fuels. The northern hemisphere forests and the oceans take a certain amount in. It comes winter, we burn more fuels, and this curve is rising. In fact, it's rising dramatically, and that's what's causing our climate catastrophe that we're currently experiencing. This idea that we have about drawdown or carbon sequestration is to both not put so much carbon in the atmosphere every year lower the amount we put in, and increase the amount we sequester. Essentially moving what we know is this classic curve that's mapping our emissions from an upward-facing curve to a downward-facing curve. So some of you saw this slide yesterday. I think we're often used to thinking about carbon as a pollutant. What I would all invite us to think about is carbon as the building block of life. Carbon is a fundamental cycle around which other cycles organize themselves. So from a biogeochemical perspective, carbon is an attractor, and it builds out these larger life systems. It's very simple, and it's not as simple as this, but you can say that water follows carbon. So when we begin to think about climate change, we think about, okay, we're increasing temperatures, we're decreasing precipitation, we're increasing evapotranspiration. We are also really fundamentally messing with our water cycles. So that's why we see these more extreme storms, that's why we see more prolonged droughts, that's why we see a destabilization in normal weather patterns, spring or fall or moisture. And what I mean by water follows carbon is, if you think about it, we have more carbon in the atmosphere, there's more heat in the atmosphere, more water stays in the atmosphere. That's why we get those heavy storms. It's called atmospheric loading. Okay, so when we put more carbon in the soil, it increases soil organic matter, among other things, and more water stays there. The soil's capacity to both absorb and hold water increases. So if we want to start thinking about these big planetary mechanisms and how we can begin to rebalance them out of this very wonky balance that they're in right now, you can begin to think about, okay, so carbon is a lever by which I can also begin to stabilize my water systems. Now that is a big generalization, and there's a lot of different things happening in the water cycle, but it is important to understand that we're not talking about regulating a pollutant. We're talking about fundamentally managing the building block of life on this planet because of the many other benefits that follow when we manage it responsibly. It's also about fertility. You saw that carbon is the keystone slide. Well, it turns out when you have more soil organic matter and you have more moisture in the soil, your cation exchange capacity changes in the soil. What does that mean? It means that the electromagnetic capacity changes and more nutrients stick around for longer. It means that your nutrient efficiency increases. And it also means that those nutrients that are more available don't run away as quickly. They don't run off into the water. They don't oxidize into the air at the same rate. And that's really important because right now our agricultural system is very reliant upon synthetic fertilizers. There's a little quote down here at the bottom that says, that UC Davis did, that says that our agriculture may be capturing as little as 30% of applied fertilizer. That's crazy, because that fertilizer ends up in the water and contaminates the water. That's why we have towns in the Central Valley that don't have drinking water, and that's why we have part of the reason why we have massive air quality problems. So, okay, so we're managing for carbon, but we're also managing for water, and we're also managing for nutrients, right? We're starting to understand that when we talk about carbon sequestration, really what we're talking about is managing for life, is managing for fertility in a way that is going to keep those nutrients around. Having more soil organic matter also helps feed the soil's microbiological community. So all that soil food web thrives, and that soil food web then makes more nutrients, more micronutrients available to plants, which in turn increases the nutrient density of those plants. So we have food that has more nutrients in it, that's better for us. Our average orange, I hear, has about 4 times less nutrients than the oranges our grandparents ate. So we may be eating a healthy diet, but we're not getting those nutrients that we need in order to thrive. Okay, so we're leaving the pretty slides behind and doing some science. Land use has resulted in large soil carbon losses over the last 12,000 years. This is a graph that kind of tracks grazing land, cropland, and soil carbon loss. We often think about carbon as coming from fossil fuel plants, coal plants, cars. Well, when we till a land, we're also breaking that carbon and oxidizing it into the air. When we burn forests, we're releasing huge amounts of stored carbon. So you can see, and people think anywhere, it's hard to tell, but there's 25 to 1/3 of the carbon that's in our atmosphere has come from the way we do agriculture, modern agriculture. The good news is that the capacity of our soils to hold carbon is vast. So this arrow's got a little bit out of sync here, but essentially you can see orders of magnitude. So our atmosphere may be holding about 760 gigatons of carbon. Through photosynthesis, you were bringing down and holding maybe about 600, it looks like, gigatons of carbon in our vegetative surface. And then our soil carbon pool is estimated to be about 2,000 gigatons or more. Now that pool is not full. So what this means is that potentially, even though we've moved all this carbon to the atmosphere, we have a very, very, very large and alive bathtub that we can fill back up again. Most of you know these two people, or maybe you've seen them. This is John Wick and his wife Peggy Rathman on their ranch in Marin, where they started the Marin Carbon Project. I think we owe a huge debt of gratitude to these two folks for really bringing their expertise and enthusiasm to this sector over the past 10 years. And I'm super happy that they have sort of retired and are back on the ranch full-time with a herd of 80 cows. Okay, so what did John and Peggy do that was so different, that made them so successful, that brought us the work of the Marin Carbon Project and the many organizations that surround it, including the work that I have done and many of you in this room have been part of? Well, they were smart. They're very long-term project managers. So they essentially said, we are going to build a program over time, and we're going to start with a pilot. What did they use for their pilot? They used compost. They did science in both Marin and in the Sierra foothills, and they found that rangelands could sequester carbon when compost was applied, and that rangelands were losing carbon in California when compost was not applied. They were very thorough with this pilot. We found also, and this is the good news, and this is something that I think people overlook, until about this research came out and some research came out around the same time, we didn't think that the soil could store carbon for the long term. We just thought the carbon came in and then went back out again, and that it took decades and maybe 100 years to store soil carbon. The really good news of this project is that we found out that you can store durable soil carbon within a year. That's massive. That means that you could actually do that drawdown piece. So that's an important thing to recognize when we think of, well, why didn't we think about this before? We didn't know about this before. This was something that we're just understanding about the soil's capacity. So compost increased the carbon and soil carbon pools from a one-time application over 5 years. We just did the 10-year measurement on the initial plots, and we should have that data back out by the spring. But models show us that that carbon sequestration after that single application of compost is likely to continue for 30 to 100 years, barring any major disruption. This big, long, hockey stick-like thing, that's the slug of carbon that comes with the compost. So there's carbon that comes with the compost and goes into the system. This symphonic kind of like notes over here, that's the ecosystem response to carbon. That's the plants photosynthesizing and bringing in photosynthetically derived new carbon to that soil system over time. Plant forage production increased after that one-time application. You can see this. Probably many of you know that the drought started about the time, they're about 2 years into this project. And so on areas where compost had been applied, even during the drought, we saw continued increases of 30 to 50% more forage on those areas. For ranchers that are dealing with increased desertification and heat, this can mean the difference between keeping your herd and not keeping your herd. For ecosystems that are under stress because of climate change, this could mean in some cases the difference between them surviving or not. It's an important aspect of this. This is important for folks who are really concerned about native plant diversity. There were 2 studies that were done and they found no statistical significant changes in native plant populations in these areas. Traditionally, studies have looked at the application of manure or biosolids or a synthetic fertilizer where the nitrogen has not been as stabilized as it is in compost. That's important because fast-growing plants, which are often noxious weeds, thrive on a flush of nitrogen to the system. So we're not advocating to go ahead and fertilize rangelands or fertilize key ecosystems. We're saying compost actually does something different. It helps the soil health increase, which helps the health of all the plant communities increase. So you don't have this risk that we've traditionally had when people have spread manure or other types of fertilizers on rangelands or grasslands that may have native plant communities in them, or that you may see that flush of noxious weeds afterwards. So these are the control plots, and you can sort of see how they worked out. This was one of 5 control and replicate plots, control and treatment replicate plots on John and Peggy's property. They did this 5 times on their property and 7 times in the Marin in the Sierra foothills. And you can see they did different applications. They had their control, their compost, a keyline plow, and then a plow plus compost. A lot of you have seen this slide as well, but it's important to note that the cows know where the compost was because the plants are more delicious. In fact, those grasses had a higher content of protein in them, just so you see this again. They actually got this photo by accident one day, but it helps you articulate the fact that this is really good for everybody who's part of that ecosystem. It's good for the soil, it's good for the plants, and it's good for the animals that are eating the plants. Okay, so we all know that that happened. The Marine Carbon Project is great. The science is groundbreaking. Well, what's happened in the meantime? We moved from pilot to demonstration. This is an important part because all of you have been involved in demonstration at some level or another, whether you know it or not. We took that trial that we did in Marin and in the Sierra foothills out to 15 sites across the state. This is a rancher, Russell Chamberlain, who's in Santa Barbara. They are a very, very, very dry area, and he's standing on a site where he has his control plot on one side and his test plot on the other side, and that was after a single application of a 1/4 inch of compost. So you can kind of see that visual effect that he saw on his property in a very dry place. Russell is currently looking for ways to get compost at a price that he can afford to do this across his entire operation. We helped pass landmark legislation. It's wonderful to see how much this group is gearing up and has supported and will continue to support 1383. That was probably one of the most challenging and rewarding things that I got to be involved with in the last couple of years was getting that legislation negotiated and passed, again with the help of many of you in the room. One thing I'll note, which I know is a little bit different for your municipal composters, but there was this rule with the State Water Resources Control Board where they have a general order on composting. And I bring this up even though that general order reversal is probably going to help on-farm composting more than it does municipal composters. I bring this up as a really important thing because they went ahead and they made this rule, the Water Resources Board, thinking that synthetic nitrogen was the same as organic nitrogen. Okay, so it took us, we'd been in these hearings like for months, and all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, they don't know that there's a difference. They are regulating compost like it's a fertilizer. Like they're regulating its application as if the nitrogen in it were water soluble 100%. And so that's an interesting thing because you might have regulators that think that they know what's going on and we think that they know what's going on and we just miss the fact that like, whoops, they don't realize the nitrogen in our compost is organic, you know? And so I think I'm also really proud of that piece of work because we took people out to ranches, we took people out to dairies, and we helped them understand that composting is actually a nutrient management best practice when you're trying to stabilize nutrients on a farm. Yeah. There's a lot of work still to do with the regional air districts. That's kind of a next big hurdle that has to be gotten through to get these composting facilities permitted up. But we have a real opportunity with county and municipal waste climate action plans and zero waste policies. There's a lot of things that didn't make it onto this slide, but I talk about this slide because what I want to impart to all of you today is that we have done a lot of work to get a basic functioning framework to create a new economy in California, and that is an organics economy, okay? So there was a lot of time and money spent to make that happen, and I really, really hope that you all end up taking advantage of it. So some lessons that we learned, this is what I was just talking about. Nutrients in compost are different than nutrients in synthetic fertilizers. They're complex, they're bound up with carbon, they're stabilized. And I put this up here because I want you all to kind of walk away with this a little bit. Like when you're talking to Department of, I don't know, like water or your water agency or your air agency, just keep saying these words, like compost stabilizes nutrients. The composting process helps complex nutrients. It's a best management practice strategy for nutrients. When we talk about our work in a way that people can understand it, it really, really helps people come along with us in this. And I love this quote from Hugh Lovell at the bottom. The aim in composting is to recycle organic wastes with minimal loss of carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients so that they become available to the food soil web. I can't emphasize this enough. It seems really simple. You might feel like you're over-explaining it to the people you're talking to. Just do it all the time. It's a really important thing to understand. Okay, so we took carbon farming from Marin County, where it had been practiced in 6 RCDs, to over 60 RCDs throughout the state. This was done with our partners with FiberShed and the Carbon Cycle Institute and the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, which is now for the first time offering carbon farm planning to any resource conservation district in the state of California. We built corporate sector buy-in. This year in March, General Mills gave a $1 million, it was a $600,000 grant to advance regenerative agriculture on 1 million acres. They did this in partnership with LA-based Kiss the Ground and the Soil Health Academy from the Midwest. We got to General Mills by going a fairly circuitous route. FiberShed, Rebecca Burgess, has been working for a long time with the North Face and VF Corporation incorporating climate beneficial fabrics that are coming off of farms that have carbon farm plans into the North Face sort of lexicon and supply chain. That got us into Annie's, where we were able to go in and talk to Annie's about carbon farming, myself and Kiss the Ground. Annie's got bought by General Mills, and they decided to do a project where they launched carbon farming with one of their partners, Organic Valley, which provides dairy to all their mac and cheese. And now Organic Valley offers carbon farm planning to any of its dairies nationwide. After that, the success of that project, we got the General Mills project through. There are many folks who helped host fundraisers for Gavin Newsom when he was running for election. We had one in San Diego, in LA, in San Francisco, in Mendocino, and in Sacramento. And at every one of our fundraisers, we pushed soil health and composting. And this year, he allocated twice as much money than we've ever seen to the Healthy Soils program. Yay! We just had a panel about this, but I'm really proud of this work. There's a lot of different folks who have helped this happen, but we've helped carve out a positive space for community composting. I really personally believe that community composters have a huge role to play in connecting the community to the act of composting, to the larger haulers, to the cities, educating and providing community buy-in and engagement, and ultimately a cleaner waste stream to help us all implement 1383. This was really big about 5 years ago. It was kind of not clear that it was legal to have a community composting operation. So carving out that legal space has been part of what we've been working to do to develop this overall organics economy. Cities are a really important link. I've been doing a bunch of work with cities, and San Francisco, again, has been a leader in this. But we have work in San Diego at the county level, in Los Angeles, and in many other cities actually now across the country, where cities are looking at how to incorporate the benefits of organics management and land application of those organics and other carbon farming practices into their carbon farm plans. The U.S. Sustainability Directors Network is going to be submitting a grant to create a tool that could be provided to cities nationally so that cities can really understand the climate benefits of engaging in organics management and getting that food back out to the land where it came from in the form of compost. No dumping. We don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to do some simple math. Applying 17 tons of compost, which is kind of what the Marin Carbon Project did, to degraded rangelands results in 1 to 3 tons of CO2 sequestered every year on an ongoing basis. That's great. You apply it once, and we know at least you're going to get 5, probably 10 years of sequestration out of it. The models think 30. Awesome. So for every ton of CO2 that's sequestered in the soil, if we're diverting that from the landfill or from a slurry pond or from an orchard where it's going to be burned, we're avoiding, and I didn't put the number up here in case David Alloway was still in the audience, but we're avoiding anywhere between 2 to 20 tons of carbon upstream. And that's based on, if you look at CalRecycle's numbers or research that has been done by Wendy Silver and her lab on life cycle management. So for every ton that gets sequestered from compost, you're mitigating between 2 to 20 tons upstream, okay? It's huge. So a 3% increase in soil organic matter over 20 million acres of agricultural lands in California gives us a nice number around CO2 sequestered, and it also helps us increase our soil water holding capacity by up to 5 million acre feet annually. That's a big deal for our state. We need a lot more compost. We don't have enough. If we utilized all the compost just for rangeland application, which is crazy because vineyards and orchards and landscapers all use this really well right now, and we don't want to take away from those markets. We want to expand the markets, but let's just theoretically say we took all of that compost and we put it on rangelands. We could maybe cover, if we were lucky, 2% of the rangelands in the state every year. So we're going to need a lot more compost. These are some heat maps I did with David Kreutzma as part of his master's project, and we looked at organic waste creation throughout the state of California. We created these maps to kind of start circling around CalRecycle and other state agencies years ago, and I want to point out, not the obvious, that we know that municipal waste is coming from cities, but that we did this in a way to try to make it look like a resource. We often think about this as a negative, as a cost. I want to start reframing the way we talk about organic waste. My father was in the oil industry. They have resource maps. This is an estimate of wood waste from orchards and vineyards. It does not count tree death. due to insect invasion or fire. If you did that, there'd be a lot more woody biomass on there. This is estimated manure from dairy cattle. Now I know it looks really small, but check out that tons per mile per year density and compare it against municipal. We have a lot of manure in this state. So here's all those resources combined, and you can kind of get a sense of what we're looking at. Obviously, there are resources coming from where there are a lot of people or where there is a lot of agricultural production. This makes sense. This is a map of the current municipal compost facilities that are in operation in the state. Don't be fooled by the size of the dots. If you look at processing capacity compared to tonnage, you will know what we all know in the room, which is we need a lot more processing capacity. So that's where you all come in. A lot of the work that I've been part of helping move forward in the last couple years is to continue to work with our leaders in the municipal composting space. Many of you are in the room, but also develop out new leaders in these other sectors, on-farm composting and community composting, in a way that's going to make the whole market thrive. We need a market with diversified products. We need a market that has diversified products at diversified price points. We need markets that are local, where it's not really costly to haul this stuff far away. So I spent the last 5 years helping develop both regulations and organizations and leaders in these spaces so that we could have models that the state could see, that you could see, that haulers could see, that new farmers or new businesses could look at and be like, there's an opportunity for me to go in there. And it's really important, I think, to realize that the success of all of these sectors actually helps the whole industry thrive, right? So we can actually build out a market economy around organics materials when we look at diversifying and growing the entire community. Also, the other thing is that's nice if we talk about carbon sequestration from municipal waste alone, but you just heard me say that we get 2 to 5% of the rangelands from that current feedstock. We need to capture the remaining feedstock, and we need to go after all of these other feedstocks so that our farmers have choices, so they don't have to buy synthetic fertilizer, so that they can start as much synthetic fertilizer, so they can start getting into carbon farming. Okay, so here we are on this really great graph that some of you may have seen John Wick draw. We did the pilot, it was super successful. We spent the past 5 years doing demonstrations across the state and communities across the state. San Diego, Los Angeles, Marin County, Yolo County. There are many, many communities of practice that have organized around carbon farming and compost production and that continue to work on what does this actually look like in my county or in my city. So we're at this nice spot where we have a gap between demonstration and business as usual. In sort of Silicon Valley lingo, some people call this the valley of death when you're looking at a new business. And it's like, okay, you're up and running, you did your pilot, you did your demonstration, now are people gonna buy it? Is it gonna fly? Is it gonna really go? And how do you bridge that space between we did it, it looks really good, people like it, and it's just how we do business every day? So just take a breath, it's a lot. This is my mountain home in Colorado, I really love it. Just put it in here to have some space. You know, you enjoy the clouds. Okay, ready? Here we go. So the state, we all know this. You read the economic impact assessment that the state did on how much it's going to cost to build out this infrastructure just for municipal, right? This did not look at dairy. It didn't even really look at community composting. It didn't look at biomass. It didn't look at forestry waste, just municipal, you know, and it's $20 billion. I don't know, it's a lot of money. They thought that, you know, maybe between rates and anything, they would need an excess of $3 to $4 billion to help spur this forward. So one of the things that we thought was important to bridge this gap in this from demonstration to business as usual was, could we get this money? Like, just theoretically, is it possible that we could maybe get this money out to the industry to really help them get going? And would people of California support this work? So Californians Against Waste and I worked on a public opinion poll that we're actually doing a webinar on tomorrow. If anyone wants to join and hear some details about the results, please let us, Nick or I, know, and we can get you signed up. But basically what we found that I think is important to note here is that, yeah, Californians, the biggest thing is roads, but that's everywhere. Everyone's like, fill the pothole, like #1 priority, fill the pothole. Okay, healthcare, yes, we know. What's interesting here is that right behind these high-level things, you also see interest in recycling and composting programs. So when we then turned around and asked them, okay, so you're interested in this, would you support this type of work, and what type of messages help you resonate with it? What do you find compelling or moving? These are some, I think these are the messages. Yeah, these are some of the messages that we found resonated with audiences. Using natural compost to grow more nutritious produce with less pesticides, using more recyclable packaging and materials, restoring lands impacted by wildfires. These are the top ones that came out of that, the messages: reducing runoff of pesticides into waterways. For whatever reason right now, there's a zeitgeist in the community and the public about chemicals. I sat on an airplane ride from Denver to LA a couple months ago, and there was a woman talking behind me on the plane, and she was like, oh, I get this great email from Trump every week, and I read about what he's doing, and it's so great, and I give him $100 every time I get the email, and did you hear about those chemicals in our food system? Like, man, that's just really bad. We got to get it out of the food system. So there is bipartisan support and understanding about the dangerousness of chemicals and pesticides. And then it's nice then when your very expensive public opinion poll comes back and confirms these overheard conversations. So that's a really good messaging point. When you use compost, you don't have to use as much pesticides. You can reduce the amount of chemicals in food. You can make your food more like organic at less cost, right? Regular cost, more like organic. That was a huge message that resonated with people. Expanding the ability of food banks to handle more donations was also pretty good up there, but not as strong. So again, if you want to hear more of those results, which we go into detail on plastics and regen ag, please let us know. There's really interesting findings in there. One I'll just mention is 7 in 10 Californians support attacks on plastics. Whoa. That's also really great. I think people are pretty fed up with plastics. We know that. But now is the time to act on that. You also have a zeitgeist because of the oceans work, oceans plastic work, because of the straw work, that you're seeing the public strongly support. 7 in 10 Californians strongly support attacks on plastics. That's a really interesting thing that we should understand and work with. Whether or not we do a direct tax or how that fits into our bills, it's worth understanding that there is public support for this now. Okay, well, let's go back for a second. An expansion and diversification of organics market has the potential to also create regionally specific jobs and safe jobs, good jobs. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. As we create a new economy, a new economic sector for organics, one that is diversified, that has many products at many price points, that are produced at many locations throughout the state, we need to do so with an ethos in mind that we are creating good jobs for people in those communities. This is an opportunity that we have to build a market that is good for us, right? Not only is compost good for the planet, we want this economy to be good for people who are living in those communities and making those composts. So as we build this new economy out, let's also build out the business relationships and the economic opportunities so we can create jobs that are safe and good for people who work in those communities, both urban and rural and agricultural. This is a great example of some people. I think this is a Northern California compost facility, folks out there working. Also, it's important to keep in mind that if we do this right, we can improve the lives of farm workers. Farm workers are handling these chemicals and pesticides every day. They are dealing with the impacts of erosion and breathing all this stuff in. It is much safer for them to handle compost than it is to have synthetic fertilizer exposure in the way that they do. So when we think about jobs and we think about safety, we also need to think about the fact that we're building out in a material economy that will physically affect a huge amount of people downstream who are handling it on a daily basis. I took this quote from Janaki, who's been doing a lot of work with CalRecycle on building in community participation to new compost facilities and their development. And I think she really says it well, that Getting community engagement up front is really important to this process. Does a community know how to operate and run a compost facility? No. That's why you're a business, or that's why you're a city. It's your job to do that. But getting those people in early and understanding how that operation could benefit them, what they need, and if this facility is capable of helping any of those needs. Blossom Valley is a beautiful example of that, and I really applaud Recology for doing a lot of work in that area to help develop out their community benefits agreement and the way that they've worked to have their operation not be a sore on that community, but be a benefit to that community. So as we look at building out infrastructure in our mad rush to try to get organic diversion, let's make sure that we invite the community to the table to help us figure out how to do that in a way that's gonna build us up and not create further blight on our folks. Okay, in summary, Earth's life systems are circular. Yay, okay. We're not talking about pollution, although sometimes we are. We're talking about reconnecting broken cycles. I like to say that a pollutant is just an element out of place. We've just taken it and put it somewhere else and it can't get back. And it's kind of fucking up everything as it does that. So it's like, it's like a stick in your wheel, and it's like, and so it's like, if we can help, we did a brilliant job pulling it out of the ground and making it into something really amazing. We can do just a brilliant job putting it back in its place. So I would invite you all to think about the fact that a pollutant is an element out of place, and to think about what cycle it may have been participating in, and now what cycle we have it in that we can help complete and restore so that we're helping the broader life cycles as we do it. Again, Beyonce and Elton John. By understanding where we interact, and influence these large planetary cycles, I believe that this sector has an opportunity to show that humans are good for the environment. Okay? We've spent a long time with a doom and gloom message. We've spent a long time with birds dying, with fish dying, with people being impacted. When we begin to participate in a positive way, we have the ability to show that we as humans can be good for the environment. We can be good for the planet. And that, I think, is a really powerful thing. And I think it's also why when we think about communications and talking about what we do, we can stop and really think about this. How can we reframe humans as good? How can we reframe that when we eat food or when we put on nice clothes, that we're doing something good for the environment? You know, that these are things, we're not bad. Like, don't not eat steak. I mean, don't eat so much steak, but, you know, like, have some thoughtfulness about it, but let's stop telling each other that we're bad. Let's start creating stories about how and where we're good. Okay, I think you got this, but please, we need a lot more quality compost. And I say quality because we all know that one bad batch causes decades of consternation and rumors. So let's keep it clean, everybody. 95% of people in California think they know what compost is, and they think it's good. That's pretty great. You know, like when we did this in the poll and people were like, do you know what compost is? You know, pretty much everyone was like, yeah, okay, I think I know what that is. Sounds pretty good, great. That's cool. I work in other spaces where like people don't know what an endocrine disruptor is. You know, I'm like, I don't know what that is. Is it bad for me? It sounds bad. Compost is like, yeah, I think that's pretty good. Cool, like I think that's a pretty good thing. I maybe disagree over exactly what it is or how magical it is. Obviously, we think it's more magical than everybody else, but it's important to understand that you have a population that kind of knows what this is and they kind of think it's good. So that's a really good place to start. I had that plastics thing. People in California are sick of plastic trash and they're willing to do something about it, so let's take advantage of that. We're building a new economy. We are building a new economy. Let's make it good for people and the planet. You right here today, the people in this room, you are the bridge that closes the gap between demonstration and business as usual. Put the little Google marker on so you know where you're going. I'm serious though. You know in this room how to get there. I know that it can be hard. I've heard a lot of reasons why it's hard. I've heard a lot of reasons why it hasn't worked in the past. But I also know that you all in this room are going to be the ones that get us there, because you're the only ones who can. Thank you.
So we have time for a couple questions. Calla, if you would stay up and. Great.
Questions?
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. So I'm sitting here being inspired to spread compost all over the hills around my community, but I thought of this one concern I wanted to ask you about. So we have these rangeland around my community, and if we put the compost on and we encourage a lot more growth, what happens in the dry season? Is there going to be more fire risk?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. Thank you for asking. So part of what Marin Carbon Project did, and the reason I brought up all those resource conservation districts, the RCDs, was carbon farm planning. So from a land management perspective, we really advocate that you do compost application as part of a larger land management plan. So in doing that whole management plan, so let's say you have some hills around your area, you might say, gosh, we're going to need to bring in some grazers at a certain time of year to make sure that we graze that biomass down. That's going to help the soil community as well if it's done appropriately. So for compost application on rangeland, there is a protocol out there that's separate from a carbon farm plan. It's actually sort of built in, weirdly enough, they kind of stuck it in the American Carbon Registry protocol for carbon offsets that was developed. So you can read it there. Or what I'd encourage you to do is work with a local land management agency or your local conservation district to come up with a conservation plan for that area that would include compost, but may include things like a tree planting or grazing management that can help you deal with that biomass. Yeah, or mowing. That depends on how it works, but that's why you really want to couple it within a larger management strategy so that over time you're managing for the health of that landscape.
Any other questions?
I got you.
No.
Thank you. I just wanted to draw a little bit of attention as I'm still learning a little bit more about the carbon markets and carbon accounting. As a for-profit company, we've committed to being climate neutral. And so as a manufacturer, we're looking at ways to use regenerative organic agriculture as the fundamental source for that. Can you speak
Great.
to carbon offsets and carbon credits for farmers?
Yeah. So this is going to sound super harsh. There is an organization whose name I'm forgetting right now, but they do a survey of all carbon markets globally every year. And last year that they found worldwide, there were 4 successful carbon offset projects in rangelands. It's kind of a myth that it's out there. There are other ways to value carbon. An offset is a very expensive mechanism for delivering what a farmer actually needs, which is upfront capital. A farmer may get between 8 and 20 cents of a dollar off of that offset dollar. You could just find other ways to give them the whole dollar. So a lot of companies now have realized that, and they're doing something called insetting, where they take money and they direct it to developing out their supply chain to be climate beneficial or carbon neutral. Then they're not buying a credit. That third-party accreditation is what takes so much of the funding out. So they're developing it internally with their supply chain. They're counting it and they're calling it insetting. That seems to be, at least in the agricultural sector, more successful. Cliff Bar has done it. Annie's is looking at doing it. Ben & Jerry's does it. There's a suite of tools I didn't talk about called the Comet Tools, like the comet through the sky. And that tool, there's a Comet Farm tool, which is more complex than the one we use here, but businesses use it to do accounting for their agricultural producers, and then they invest a certain amount to try to inset that work. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
thank you again. This is really eye-opening, and it's a great follow-up on what we've heard from John Wick in the past. When he was last here, he was talking about trying to find ways of funding the ranchers to be able to bring the compost onto their farms. You showed us the good picture of the guy in Santa Barbara. This is what I want. I need more of it. But you mentioned that he was struggling to afford it. Has there been any traction on funding strategies John had talked about possibly in the Farm Bill? Are there other things we can be doing through the funding that we have available to us to help with this?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm sure Nick has many responses for you. So yes, we got some provisions in the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill this last round had new provisions for a Healthy Soils pilot program where they're offering incentives for farmers to increase soil health. Not specifically compost, but compost can be part of that. We did increase that funding for the Healthy Soils Initiative. We're trying to make it easier to access. One of the things that's like a pet project idea of mine is that if we could, have some incentive that was easier for people to get for compost application, maybe like a rebate program of some sort for certain eligible practitioners. Like if you have a carbon farm plan and you're a rancher, you can get compost and get a rebate for it. That I think could work really well, in addition to the Healthy Soils funding. I did a project with a county in Colorado recently where they said, we're going to build a new compost facility and we want to do it in a way where we can offer compost to eligible producers at a price point that's competitive with synthetic fertilizer. So they built into their business model the ability to, their tip fees and how they're capitalizing that facility in such a way that they can have a certain percentage of the compost that they sell every year go out at a very reduced rate to people that they believe qualify for that compost. I think that was a really great example. Certainly the insetting has been another thing. That wool beanie up there from North Face, Rebecca Burgess and Jeff Creek were successful at getting the North Face to actually invest in that farmer getting an on-farm composting system so that they could produce their own compost. And they gave them a grant to help that system get set up. So I think there are many, many opportunities to do that. I do think that there's still a cost issue. Obviously, most of the compost that's quality goes to high-value crops, which is great, and it should continue to go there. That's why I'm really talking about, can we create diversification in the marketplace? Can we have products like overs that might be cheaper for ranchers? Are there other ways to create opportunities for them to access that compost so we're not just trying to compete with the current market? Let's grow the current market and let's grow some new markets around it. Yeah.
One last question.
Kevin gets the last word.
Well, at the session that you just held before this lunch, Neil Edgar said something that was really important that I thought you might pick up on about how recognizing, I think a lot of us are reflecting on the 30 or so years some of us have been doing this, and that we, in some ways, we've worked our way into a corner, sort of a race to the bottom instead of a race to the top, which you referred to a moment ago about the getting quality, and you just referred to it when you said there's some diversification of the types of compost and the different uses. I guess talk a little more about that, because I think when you said we are the group that can do this, we have, all of us here, some of us working 30 and 40 years towards what we thought was a climate solution, found ourselves in a funny spot where the recycling piece is working, but the organic piece that we're about to invent, essentially, can we avoid, what are the lessons that we can learn about avoiding the pitfalls? For instance, when we offshored all of our material to China and decimated our own industries here so that we have to rebuild them, that was an error that we made 30 years ago. Or it was market forces that did it, I'm not quite sure which. But was there any more that we could talk about here as we step across this, that gap of death there, to make sure that it really is that positive race to the top, not a race to the bottom?
Yeah, what a good question. Well, one of the things we talked about in the community compost session was understanding that people in your communities who might be doing this work, finding ways for it not to be competition, but to be value add. that there's a huge value in keeping a small amount of that compost locally, and while it might look very small against CalRecycle's numbers and your overall tonnage, it's actually very, very large from a human perspective, and that it teaches people about these cycles of life. It gets their hands in the dirt, it gets kids knowing where their food comes from, and that the value in that messaging of door to door, of neighbor to neighbor, is really essential in creating excitement about and understanding of compost. So, community composters as your ambassadors, as your educators, and as viable small businesses and small, medium to sized businesses, and that there really is space in that marketplace, and that developing out and helping the community composters develop out is actually going to be key to the success of all municipal composting in the long run, because of that particular niche that they sit in, not necessarily from a tonnage perspective, but from a local food security perspective and from an implementation perspective. And again, I guess I'd put that question back out onto you. I've been in this space for 5 years, and many of you all have been in it for 20 to 30. I think really what I'm asking you to do is to think creatively. Like, how do we get over that gap? And that creativity happens at your local level. I had the really great honor of watching the Zero Waste team in San Francisco roll it out deliberately over a long period of time and stage those incentives and think in the long game and really work with their hauler and their community in a progressive way. Different jurisdictions have different power or authority, or haulers have different relationships with those jurisdictions. I think this requires us all coming to the table, inviting new people like community composters and farmers to that table, and sitting down and figuring out what people need. And I guess that's one thing I would all say to you to go away with and think about is, like, given that you are the bridge, what do you need to make that bridge happen? And, like, what are your experiences that have taught you lessons about what not to do, but not to be constrained by what hasn't worked in the past? Because I think that the state, and I think companies and increasingly cities, are going to be coming and saying, how do we do this, right? And so when I hear generalized, don't take this the wrong way, when I hear generalized complaints, my first question is, but what do you need? But what would help overcome that complaint? Like, theoretically, hypothetically, in a perfect world, what do you need? Okay, so that's not a perfect world, let's back up from there, but now we know what you need. And now we can fit it into the framework of what we have. But if we're only working in the framework of what we've had before, and we're not talking about what we really need and the lessons that we have, we're not gonna move anywhere beyond where we've been. So I guess I'd ask all of you to go home or go back to your work today and think about, what do I need to do this well in my community? Like, what are my goals, and what would I need to reach those goals? And then you have a whole community. CRRA, we saw last night, is an incredible, tremendous community of resources and minds to think about this. And we have new actors like community composters and farmers and businesses who also want to try to figure out how to get this done. The philanthropic sector has identified cities and organic waste as an area of opportunity in climate change. Go talk to your local philanthropists, help figure this out. So I guess, Kevin, to answer your question, I don't know, but you know. So I'm gonna ask you to all think about what that is, and then turn around and tell the rest of the world how we can help you do it.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's amazing and extremely inspiring. I think we've all been given our marching orders. We have the tools. We can be successful. We even actually have some recycling history books on each of your tables there, so please take a look at that. We look towards the past and we learn from that, and it's wonderful to actually hear today from somebody to say to do good for the people and for the planet. So this is a positive message that we need to bring forward as we go home. So thank you, CRRA. Thank you for being our Recycling Zero Waste family. I love you guys. See you next year.